And most people had never heard of Admiral McRaven, and of course he's now a kind of iconic figure because he commanded the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. And of course Disney tried to trademark SEAL Team 6 after the bin Laden raid. It's a true story. But the way that I discovered the identity of Admiral McRaven was in February of 2010, there was a raid in Gardez in Afghanistan in Paktia province. And a U.S. Special Operations team had intelligence that there was a Taliban compound and that people living in a particular compound in this area were members of the Taliban and were plotting attacks against American forces. And they raid this compound in the middle of the night. And they end up killing a number of men and 2 pregnant women. And it turned out that this was not a Taliban family. In fact, they weren't even ethnic Pashtun. They were from a minority ethnic group in the province. And the man of the house was a senior Afghan police commander who had been trained by the U.S. forces. And his family showed me his documents. He had actually been trained by a private security company called MPRI, which is made up of high-ranking former military officials, intelligence officials, and others. And so these women were killed. This Afghan police commander who had fought with U.S. soldiers against the Taliban and against the Haqqani network in his province, and whose house was filled with pictures of him and U.S. soldiers smiling in these pictures, had just been killed. And when the commandos the U.S. commandos that raided the house realized that they had killed these women and that the men that they had killed were not in fact Taliban, and that what they were doing that night was the most anti-Taliban of things they could have been doing, which was to be having a party with live music celebrating the naming of a child, and men were dancing and playing instruments, and it was this loud, boisterous party, and we have their cell phone video from that night. So they raid this house, these people are killed. Instead of saying, wow, we really messed up, and owning it, and that stuff happens every day in Afghanistan. People are getting killed all the time that have no attachment whatsoever to the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or the Haqqani network, and the U.S. will often just pay them a little bit of money and move on, and it never makes it into the papers. That wouldn't have been out of place, but instead of doing that, they dug the bullets out of the women's bodies, and then they told their commanders that what had happened in the compound that night was a Taliban ambush of this family, and that they had come upon these women who had been killed by the Taliban. And then there were leaks saying that, well, no, this was actually an honor killing, and the women were killed by their own family members. And they put out a press release, and spokespeople made these statements saying that the U.S. soldiers were essentially heroes that had gone in there and saved everyone else. But then the family members, because they were a prominent family, one of the fathers of the women was the vice dean at Gardez University, who spoke fluent English, started calling reporters and telling people, you know, this is not what NATO is saying. Then a very great reporter named Jerome Starkey actually went down there. He writes for the Times of London and interviewed the family members and did a story saying that this was a NATO raid. He didn't know it was JSOC at the time, that this was a botched NATO raid and that NATO had tried to cover it up. And he told the story of these families. And when Jerome Starkey did this, NATO did something extraordinary. They named him in a press release and said Jerome Starkey of the Times of London is lying. They actually accused him of lying. And I mean, that could have ended Starkey's career. And Starkey, to his credit, kept pushing and pushing and ended up doing a number of stories and got close to that family. And Rick and I also went to this family and filmed with them. And you see this in our video, and tell this story and tell the story of what happened to Jerome Starkey as well. So media attention is focused in now on this village and this one family's compound. And eventually, NATO calls up Starkey and they said, we're about to put out a press release. We're going to change our version of events. And they admit that their forces had killed, that NATO forces had killed these pregnant women and that the men were not Taliban commanders. So the family told me and told Jerome Starkey the same thing, which is that they got a call and a person they believed was General Stanley McChrystal was going to be coming to visit them. And at the time, McChrystal was the commander of all U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan. And they actually were plotting, they wanted to kill General McChrystal. They wanted to stab him to death when he came into their home. And one of the men told me that when they did this, to my family, I wanted to put on a suicide vest and blow myself up among the Americans. Remember, these were U.S. allies. And now they're saying, I want a suicide vest and I want to kill General McChrystal, who was the leader of the war. And an imam at their local mosque said, no, you're not to do that. You're to give him hospitality like our people do, and you're welcome him into your home and hear what he has to say. So they thought that General McChrystal was coming to see them. They called Jerome Starkey. Starkey goes down there with his photographer, Jeremy Kelly, and they're waiting with the family, thinking that McChrystal's going to show up. And up pulls this convoy of vehicles with countless Afghan military officials and some Americans interspersed with them. And in the center of this crowd is a guy with a name tag that says McRaven on it, and has 3 stars on the lapel. And they've brought with them 2 sheep. And they approached the compound in the very place where the women had been killed and this police commander had been killed. And they offload these sheep and they put a knife up to the sheep's neck, and they're going to sacrifice the sheep. And what they were doing was a ritual from these people's culture, the people who were the victims of this, and it was like a forgiveness ritual. So they're coming. Admiral McRaven shows up with some sheep after this family had been gunned down, and then they had blamed it on the family, and then said it was Taliban, and this scene is unfolding. This photographer, Jeremy Kelly, starts taking pictures of, he didn't know who he was at the time, of Admiral McRaven. And at the time, Admiral McRaven was the commander of the most elite, secretive U.S. military force. And he shows up with a sheep in Gardez, Afghanistan, and they're offering to sacrifice it. And the American and Afghan forces try to stop the photographer. They try to hit the camera away. They say that Starkey and Jeremy Kelly are not allowed in. But the family, and it was so smart of them, the family said, no, we want him here as a witness so that someone independent is here to know what goes on today. And so they have photos, and Starkey took in shorthand all the notes of what McRaven said in the room that day. And McRaven admitted to the head of this household that it was his forces that had killed these pregnant women and the Afghan police commander, and he apologized. And then there were all these stories that went out on ABC News and others that the head of the household had accepted the apology. When I spoke to him, he said, I don't accept their apology at all. He said, the special forces did cruel things to us. They beat us, they ruined our life, they wiped out our economy in our compound by taking away all of these people, and they killed our pregnant women. I wouldn't trade my 2 sons for the entire kingdom of the United States, is what he said. And another man chimed in and he said, these are these commandos with beards. We call them the American Taliban. And this is an anti-Taliban family.